The day I unlocked the door to my river cabin, I thought I'd made the smartest purchase of my life. Quiet water, no neighbors in sight, and a deed that clearly showed my land stopped well short of the nearby HOA boundary. I was still breathing, in the smell of pine and river mist, when a white envelope appeared in my mailbox, stamped urgent, demanding $18,000 for land maintenance violations. That was the moment I realized this wasn't a peaceful cabin story, it was a warning shot. And if you've ever wondered how far an HOA will reach when they smell money, stay with me, because this one went places I never expected. I'd bought the cabin after years of saving, a narrow structure perched safely above the riverbank, surrounded by wild grass and cottonwoods. The listing was clear, outside HOA jurisdiction. No dues, no rules, no committees measuring grass height. That freedom was the selling point. I even paid for a survey before closing, watching the surveyor hammer pink flags into the ground, marking boundaries that stopped well before the manicured lawns upstream. When the papers were signed, I slept better than I had in years. 2 weeks later, the letter arrived. The HOA claimed I owed fees for erosion control, trail repairs, and shared river access preservation. The kicker was the map attached, conveniently redrawn to include my cabin inside their zone. They demanded payment within 10 days, or they'd escalate. I laughed at first. Surely this was a clerical mistake. So I called the number listed. The woman on the phone didn't hesitate. She said the river shifted over time, and therefore so did their authority. According to her, if the river touched land they managed everything nearby. I asked where that was written. She told me it was under review, and suggested I pay now to avoid penalties. That night, I spread my documents across the cabin table, listening to the river slap rocks outside. Deeds, surveys, county plats, all saying the same thing. I wasn't in their HOA, yet the threat felt real. Liens, lawyers, endless letters. I realized this wasn't about rules. It was about control, and they thought I was an easy target. I stood on the porch, watching moonlight ripple across the water, and understood something important. This cabin wasn't just a getaway anymore. It was a line in the sand. If I backed down now, they'd keep pushing, not just me, but anyone who lived quietly outside their fence lines. The silence felt heavy, like the river itself was waiting patiently. Before I responded, I decided to document everything, because if this fight escalated, I wanted proof from day one. By the next morning, the cabin felt less like a retreat and more like a command center. I set my phone on the table, hit record, and started logging everything. Dates, times, names. If the HOA wanted a fight, I wasn't stepping in blind. I drove into town and pulled records from the county assessor, the planning office, and the zoning department. Every clerk told me the same thing. My property was not, and never had been, part of the HOA. One woman even raised her eyebrows and said, "They've tried this before." That was the first crack in the image of an isolated mistake. Back at the cabin, another letter waited, this one sterner, referencing fines accumulating daily. They claimed my riverbank grass was non-compliant and my dock, an old wooden platform built decades ago, violated HOA aesthetic standards. Standards I'd never agreed to. Standards that didn't legally apply to me. I called again, this time calmly, and asked for written proof of their authority. The board representative sighed as if I were being difficult. She explained that the HOA had an obligation to protect property values and that my cabin, though technically outside the boundary, affected the visual experience of their residents. I asked if visual experience now came with an invoice. She didn't laugh. Instead, she told me their attorney was reviewing the matter and suggested I consider settlement, $18,000, for land they didn't own, manage, or tax. I hung up and felt that familiar pressure behind my eyes, the kind that comes when you realize someone is trying to scare you into compliance. That afternoon, a man in a polo shirt, with the HOA logo, walked down the river path and stopped at my fence line. He didn't cross it. He just stood there, clipboard in hand, taking photos. When I stepped outside and asked what he was doing, he said he was documenting shared resources. I told him this wasn't shared. He smiled thinly and said, "That's not how the board sees it." Something clicked then. This wasn't about rules. It was about expansion. The riverfront was valuable, and my cabin sat on a stretch they couldn't control. If they could bully me into paying, maybe next came dues, then restrictions, then forced compliance. I waved him off and told him to leave. He did, but not before warning me that ignoring the HOA would get expensive. That night, I drafted a formal response, attaching surveys, deeds, and county letters. I sent it certified mail, refusing the charges and demanding they cease contact. As I sealed the envelope, the river outside roared louder than usual, swollen from recent rain. It felt like a reminder. Boundaries matter, even when powerful people pretend they don't. But I had a feeling this letter wouldn't end things. It would escalate them. The response from the HOA arrived faster than expected, and it wasn't an apology. It was a notice of intent. They planned to place a lien on my property for unpaid assessments, citing Expanded Environmental Stewardship Authority. The language was dense, legal, and deliberately intimidating. I read it twice, then a third time, feeling anger replace anxiety. A lien meant banks, credit, resale. It was a serious move, and they were betting I'd panic. Instead, I drove straight to the county clerk. I handed over the notice and asked a simple question. Could an HOA file a lien on land outside its jurisdiction? The clerk didn't even hesitate. She said no, not without a court order, and even then it would be challenged. She stamped copies of my deed and suggested I speak with a property attorney. Not because I was wrong, but because the HOA was likely counting on me not knowing my rights. The attorney confirmed it. The HOA had no standing. What they were doing skirted harassment, possibly fraud. He explained a pattern he'd seen before. Associations slowly testing boundaries, sending aggressive bills, hoping owners would pay rather than fight. Most people did. Fighting took time, confidence, and documentation. Armed with that, I sent a second letter, this one from the attorney's office. It demanded they withdraw the bill, cease harassment, and preserve all records related to my property. It also warned that further action could result in legal consequences. For the first time, the tone shifted. 2 days passed in silence. Then an email arrived from the HOA president. It was friendlier, almost neighborly. He said there had been confusion regarding river-adjacent parcels and suggested a meeting to clear things up. I agreed, but only on record, with my attorney present. The meeting took place in a community hall upstream. Polished wood floors and framed photos of smiling residents. The board sat across from me, papers neatly stacked. They argued the river was a shared asset and that properties like mine benefited from their maintenance. My attorney calmly slid the survey across the table and reminded them that benefit did not equal authority. When the president realized they weren't getting $18,000, his demeanor hardened. He hinted at zoning complaints, environmental reviews, anything that could make my life difficult. That was the moment I understood how far they were willing to go. As we left, my attorney whispered that this was no longer just defense. It was leverage. And if the HOA didn't back off now, the consequences could be very public. Back at the cabin, the river flowed steady and indifferent. It had seen borders drawn and erased before. This time, I intended to make sure the line held. The pressure campaign started quietly, the way these things often do. A zoning inspector showed up one morning, claiming an anonymous complaint about my septic system. The inspection found nothing wrong. A week later, an environmental officer checked for river runoff violations. Again, nothing. Each visit was polite, professional, and clearly prompted by someone upstream with time and influence. The HOA wasn't billing me anymore, but they weren't backing off either. They were trying to exhaust me. Instead of reacting, I started anticipating. My attorney filed public records requests for every communication the HOA had sent to county offices about my property. What came back was revealing. Emails, attachments, internal notes. The HOA had openly discussed bringing the river cabin into compliance and referred to my land as future HOA adjacent revenue 1. Board member even joked that I'd fold once the costs stacked up. That email changed everything. We compiled the evidence into a clean timeline and sent a formal notice of intent to pursue damages for harassment, abuse of process, and misrepresentation. We didn't threaten loudly. We simply laid out facts and statutes, citing their own words. For the first time since this began, weeks passed without a single letter, visit, or call. Then the river flooded. Heavy rain upstream pushed the water over its banks, tearing through a section of HOA-maintained trail and collapsing a decorative retaining wall they'd installed too close to the edge. My cabin, set back and built with the natural flow in mind, stayed dry. The irony was hard to ignore. Their environmental stewardship had failed, and now repairs would be expensive. The HOA called an emergency meeting and, shortly after, sent me a notice, not a bill, but a request. They wanted access across my land to bring in equipment, claiming it was the only feasible route. My attorney replied that access could be discussed, but only after all claims against me were formally withdrawn and acknowledged as improper. The next email I received was a draft agreement. The HOA conceded my property was outside their jurisdiction, withdrew the $18,000 demand, and agreed to record a statement, with the county clarifying the boundary to prevent future disputes. In exchange, I granted temporary access for repairs, under strict conditions. Standing on my porch, watching crews work upriver, I felt a strange calm. Not victory exactly, but balance restored. They'd pushed until reality pushed back harder. The river didn't care about HOAs or boundaries on paper. It respected only preparation and truth, and in the end, that truth had been enough to stop them. But one final step remained, and it would make sure this never happened again. The final paperwork was signed on a quiet morning, the kind where the river moves like glass and sound carries farther than usual. The HOA recorded their boundary clarification with the county, a formal admission that my cabin and surrounding land were never within their authority. My attorney made sure the language was airtight, permanent, and visible to anyone who pulled the records in the future. No reinterpretation, no confusion, just facts locked in place. But I wasn't done yet. Using the same public records laws that exposed their emails, I requested documentation for other parcels along the river. What I found was troubling. Several properties, all outside the HOA zone, had received similar maintenance assessments over the years. Most owners paid without challenging them. Small amounts at first, a few thousand here, a few thousand there. It added up. I shared the information with those owners, quietly, respectfully, one by one. They confirmed the pattern. Pressure, threats, settlements, none of it legal. Together, we filed a joint complaint with the county and the state oversight office that monitored HOAs. This time, the attention wasn't easy for the board to deflect. An investigation followed. Fines were issued. The HOA was ordered to revise its enforcement practices and notify residents of the corrected boundaries. The president resigned. The attorney who had encouraged creative interpretation of authority stopped returning calls. The riverfront, for the first time in years, belonged clearly to those who actually owned it. Back at my cabin, life slowed again. Mornings meant coffee on the porch. Evenings meant the sound of water over stone. The stress faded, replaced by something steadier. Confidence. I hadn't set out to fight an HOA. I just wanted a quiet place by the river. But when someone tries to charge you $18,000 for land they don't control, silence becomes permission. The lesson wasn't about winning. It was about knowing where your line is and refusing to let someone redraw it for their convenience. HOAs thrive on the assumption that no one will push back. Sometimes, all it takes is one person with documents, patience, and the willingness to stand still while others overreach. I still get mail at the cabin, flyers, utility notices, the occasional fishing newsletter, but no more white envelopes stamped urgent. The river flows where it always has, indifferent to paper boundaries, yet protected by them when it matters. And every time I unlock that door, I remember how close I came to paying for something that was never theirs to sell.